From KGW News, this is Straight Talk with Laurel Porter.
Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. One of Oregon's favorite sons, famed New York Times columnist and two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Nicholas Kristof is out with a new book, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. It's a memoir about Kristof's life, from his childhood on his family's farm in Yamhill, Oregon, to his education at Harvard and a Rhodes Scholarship, to a career at the New York Times, where he reported from all corners of the world and covered century-defining events, including the protests and massacre at Tiananmen Square in China, for which he and his wife Shara Wudunn won a Pulitzer Prize, to the Darfur genocide in Sudan, winning another Pulitzer, to the challenges of addiction and despair in his hometown of Yamhill. We also get the inside story of his attempted run for Oregon governor in 2022 and his view of the problems plaguing the city of Portland. Even as Kristof reported on oppression, genocide, documenting atrocities, often at great risk to his own life, even when faced with the worst of humanity, he also found the best of it and reason for hope. As another Oregon favorite and KGW alum Ann Curry writes of the book, delightful and inspiring, Chasing Hope is an illuminating and at times hilarious read about an American farm boy who grew into a brave international correspondent and discovered truths that made a vast difference in the world. Please welcome my guest, Nicholas Kristof. Welcome back to Straight Talk.
Great to be with
Nick.
you, Laurel.
And I have to say, I really agree with Ann. This was a really great book, and it is a page-turner.
You know, if TV doesn't work out, you should be a book reviewer.
I would love to do it. Well, I can't wait to hear more about your book and find out more about it. You know, the last time I interviewed you was out at the family farm, and we were talking about
God's
your candidacy. Exactly, your candidacy for governor. And we'll talk more about that later. But when that didn't work out the way you wanted it to, is that what prompted you to write your memoir and reflect on your life?
Yeah, I mean, truly in the acknowledgments, if I was being completely honest, I would have thanked the Secretary of State, Yamhill County at the time, for giving me the, once out of the race, I had all this time. I didn't need to ask an editor for book leave. And so I wanted to write a book partly to share how I came to deeply, care about a lot of issues and to try to bring readers into those issues that I care a lot about.
Well, you start your book off with this harrowing tale of being in the heart of the Congo War. You're in a plane that is crashing, and you were worried that you were going to die there in the rainforest, far from your family. And you don't tell the reader exactly what happened until later in the book, so I'm on the edge of my seat, but it's one of many hair-raising close calls that you had. But in that chapter, you talk about the choice you made for that brand of journalism that was risky, that was dangerous, but had purpose. Tell us more about that choice you made.
So I think that there's often a tendency, a lot of us in journalism get tugged toward, national politics, the White House and so on. And, that's important. But I think there's sometimes a danger of stenography journalism where we are kind of just taking notes. And I don't think that does all that we in journalism can do. And I think that fundamentally where we can really play a useful role is providing accountability, investigating, and going to neglected issues, whether abroad or at home, and by covering them, help project them onto the agenda. So that is what I've tried to do imperfectly, from a plane crash in Congo to addiction issues here in Oregon.
And you said some of the ones that had the most impact, your columns, are ones where people weren't aware of issues.
That's right. I mean, I aim to make people spill their coffee in the morning. And I think when I write about guns or abortion, I don't really change anybody's mind. But I think where we can have impact, not just in my New York Times column, but any of us in journalism, is by just shining a light on an issue that people aren't paying attention to, and thereby forcing difficult conversations about how to address it.
Well, let's go back to your childhood on your family farm in Yamhill, and your parents had a great influence on you. Your dad's story of escaping communism and Nazis in Eastern Europe and making his way to a new life in America. And there's a thread that runs through your book of this hope. You say it infected you, your dad's story infected you with hope. How so?
people are always kind of surprised when they meet me. I mean, you know, I write about war and genocide and poverty, et cetera, and they expect to meet this really, you know, dour, grim pessimist. And in fact, what I have learned covering these issues is that we are an amazing species. And yes, we have enormous challenges, but when we get it right, when we work together to actually tackle these challenges in an evidence-based way, we can make amazing progress. And I have seen that in my life. You know, one of the stories that just meant the most to me was this incredible woman in rural Pakistan, Mukhtar, and she had been sentenced to be gang raped by this local village council. And then they carried it out, and they expected her to kill herself from shame. And Mukhtar somehow found it in herself to prosecute her attackers, send them to prison, and they used compensation money to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to overcome the kind of misogyny that had led to the attack on her. And you can't visit that school and see the children of her attackers enrolled there and talk to Mukhtar and not just feel a measure of hope about what humanity is capable of when fully tested.
That's just amazing story of resilience.
Incredible strength, incredible resilience, incredible courage.
Well, let's jump to 1982, and you are a student at Oxford, you're a Rhodes Scholar, and you're scheming with a fellow student of how you're going to use your vacation to go to Ghana to write for the Wall Street Journal, and Ghana is in chaos, and you very nearly got shot. I mean, it must have been terrifying, but you say it was one of the most useful learning experiences you ever had in journalism. Tell us what happened and what you learned.
So, Laurel, I think, frankly, that we in journalists sometimes take too many risks. And I've just seen this, that you just get a group of journalists at a bar in some conflict, and they're scheming what they're going to do the next day. And together they decide to go down some road that any of them individually would know that's not a good idea. And I think one reason I've tried to be a little more careful was that time in 1982 with my friend when everything was going fine. I was really full of myself. Oh, this new Hemingway, et cetera. And then all of a sudden we were at a checkpoint and there were two drunken soldiers and they robbed us. And for a moment I thought they were going to shoot us and toss our bodies in the jungle. And it was just so terrifying. And that chill from that has stayed with me over the decades. And it has reminded me that everything is going fine until all of a sudden it isn't and you're dead. And that we are responsible not only for our own safety, but obviously, you know, we care about our loved ones, what we're putting them through, and our interpreters, our drivers, and we have to think about them too. So that that terror of that day in 1982 has, I think, helped keep me alive since. And
you didn't just want to take those risks for a byline. It had to be for a greater purpose.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, who wants to risk their life for the quarterly earnings of their news organization? But when we cover these kind of neglected crises, that can make a real difference. In the Darfur genocide, you know, it was so frustrating that hundreds of thousands of people died, and we could have prevented those deaths. But there are hundreds of thousands of people who are alive today because journalists, aid groups, some officials worked, and a lot of students around the country, frankly, organized and worked to raise that issue. And that's a reminder that, you know, we do have this influence in journalism, and with that comes a real responsibility.
And worth taking the risk in that case. And we'll talk more about Darfur in a moment. I want to take you to China now. And you're working for the New York Times. You spent 5 years in China, and you said it was transformative for you. You were the bureau chief in Beijing. You were newly married to Shara Wu Dun, who was the first Chinese-American reporter at the New York Times. On your 30th birthday, you were witness to the beginning of student demonstrations at Tiananmen Square. And after that, those protests surged. And then on June 3rd, 1989, you found yourself in the middle of a massacre when the People's Liberation Army waged war on the people. And you say at that moment you wanted to run, but instead you ran toward the gunfire. How were you feeling about the danger you were in and what you were witnessing right then?
I remember Russia, I was bicycling toward the massacre and, you know, hearing the gunfire ahead and this enormous crowd streaming in the other direction, thinking, what a crazy job we have when we are rushing toward gunfire, when everybody with a brain is rushing the other direction. I mean, I was completely terrified, but I was also just so angry. I mean, you just never forget seeing a modern army turn weapons of war on unarmed protesters. And I wanted to fight back, and the weapons I have are my laptop and my camera. And you know, the other thing that I've thought about that terrible night was that in this country, you know, we've had challenges to democracy, and I think that's partly because Americans sometimes take for granted the institutions of democracy we have, the guardrails, the referees, and those folks out on Tiananmen Square, they were risking their lives for democracy because they didn't enjoy it and they understood how valuable it is. And I think there's a lot that we in this country can learn from those Chinese who were risking their lives and sometimes dying for democracy.
And then you and Cheryl worked around the clock documenting that. You ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize, the first husband and wife team to win a Pulitzer Prize. And you also tell the story of a young Chinese man, an escaped felon. You helped him flee China. He was a source. He helped you at the New York Times, and that was partly why he was in trouble, is because he helped you. And you said it was a moral dilemma whether to help him escape. Now that all these years have passed, how do you view that decision to help him flee China?
It's pretty clear that journalists shouldn't be helping escaped felons flee the country. And, you know, we were risking the New York Times bureau there. We would have been in terrible trouble if caught. And so I was deeply conflicted. On the other hand, here's this kid who's, you know, already been imprisoned because he had helped the New York Times, and then he escaped from prison. And so I think helping him was maybe the most unprofessional thing I've ever done as a journalist, but also one that I'm proudest of. He got to Hong Kong with our help, then we helped him get to the US. He's now an American. He's alive. And you've got to feel good about that.
And I've enjoyed that part of your book where you talk about some of the mistakes you might have made, some of the moral dilemmas that you faced. One of the things you did was you traveled across Asia reporting on girls and boys forced into the sex trade, and nothing could compare to what you witnessed, what you saw in a small village in Cambodia, brothels imprisoning young teenage girls and auctioning them off for their virginity. One young girl, Sophia's story, really haunted you. How did that affect your future reporting?
I thought I was going to do one story about sex trafficking in Asia, but when you meet these little kids who've been kidnapped in the villages and then are being sold for their virginity, and they tell you that if they escape, that the police would just arrest them and hand them right back to the brothel owner. You know, this felt just like 19th century slavery, except these girls were going to be dead of AIDS by their 20s. And it's very hard to go from that, and you know, you go home and you hug your children, but you just can't get that out of your mind. And so then I began writing more about human trafficking around Asia and other countries, in India and Pakistan and Malaysia, in Vietnam and in Philippines. And then I began to wonder about the situation in the US. And trafficking in some ways isn't as bad in the US as it is in Cambodia, but we don't have the moral authority to tell Cambodia what to do unless we make some greater effort to fix the situation here. And we do have a trafficking crisis in the US. And so that has been one of the things that I've been reporting on, and it was all because of meeting these girls like Sophia and the way they have haunted me ever since.
And you and your wife went on to write a book about women's challenges across the world called Half the Sky in 2009. I want to jump ahead to Darfur, and you mentioned it earlier. You won a second Pulitzer Prize for your reporting on the genocide in Darfur, a region in Sudan where you documented atrocities and the Sudanese government's efforts to wipe out villages that were home to 3 Black African ethnic groups. And you often had to get creative and sneak into the country, very dangerous situations. What compelled you to keep going back? I think you said you went back a dozen times.
Each time I went, I thought, okay, this is going to be the last. And then, you know, I just think about the villages that I've seen that have been burned, the bodies thrown into wells to poison the wells so nobody can go back there, the women who've been gang raped and then mutilated to mark them forever as rape victims, to shame them and to shame the community. And you just want to fight back. And the way you do that is by reporting. And so there were these very hairy trips driving across the border from Chad, or at one point, Kofi Annan, when he was Secretary General, he made a 2-hour trip into Darfur, and he agreed to take me in, and then with his permission, I missed the plane out. And so then I was in Darfur, and the authorities didn't know, and I was free to report. And but it was sort of funny. There were checkpoints all over manned by the soldiers committing the genocide, and I wasn't sure how I'd get through, but I realized the UN officials were going through and waving their UN passes in English. And I figured these soldiers can't read English. So I took out my United Airlines Mileage Plus card.
Genius.
Waved it. And it is amazing the respect that people committing genocide have for United Airlines.
Very creative to get that. Well, there's a thread that runs through your book in finding the line between reporting and getting into the arena, as you call it, and engaging in public policy, like helping the escaped felon flee China, to trying to end genocide in Darfur through your writing. You wrote, you wondered if your drive to get to dangerous places in Darfur was high-minded or reckless pursuit of glory. Where have you decided that line is? What is your moral obligation?
So I think that we, as journalists, we have our professional obligations, but we also have obligations to each other. And so when we come across a child who is dying, we don't just sit down with our notebooks or a camera and chronicle that. We have some paramount obligation to that child or to those people we cover. And how we resolve these contradictions, I don't think there's any algorithm. I don't think there's any easy principle. But the way I think of it is, I want to be able to put on a billboard, okay, Kristof did this. I want to explain to people what happened. And I think if we're transparent, that's kind of the first step. And I think that holds true whether we're in Portland or in South Sudan. But fundamentally, I think we have obligations to each other. And if we as journalists ask for some special privileges to report, we should be held accountable for also showing a special responsibility.
People watching may be thinking, gosh, you've witnessed so many terrible things and atrocities, and then I know your loss of your father was really difficult on you and took a toll on your mental health. How do you find peace and healing?
So in writing Chasing Hope, I kind of self-diagnosed myself with a certain amount of PTSD from just being terrified, frankly, in a lot of places a lot of the time. And then I realized that I had maybe self-prescribed myself wilderness therapy for my self-diagnosed PTSD. And I just went off backpacking, dragged my wife and especially my kids and above all my daughter, backpacking in the mountains as I think my healing process. And coming back to the farm, again, the wilderness. My daughter was a great psychologist by accompanying me on these backpacking trips.
And she took the picture on the cover of your book on the Pacific Crest Trail? That's
on the Pacific Crest Trail. Caroline and I hiked that all the way 2,650 miles from Mexico to Canada.
That's impressive.
Best parenting I ever did.
Well, we're going to talk more with Nicholas Kristof when we come back about his run for governor and some of the lessons that he learned. We're back in 2 minutes. Welcome back to Straight Talk. I'm Laurel Porter. We're talking with New York Times columnist and author Nick Kristof about his new book, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. Nick, once again, it's great to have you here. Thank you.
Great to be with you.
Well, let's talk about your run for governor in 2022. And when I interviewed you out on your farm about your candidacy, you told me that one of the reasons you were running is you felt like the elected leaders at the time weren't doing an adequate job of addressing the really important problems facing Oregon, including low graduation rates for high school students, the fact that we were near last with access to mental health care in the country and probably still are pretty close to the bottom on that, and elected leaders or political leaders and your friends were encouraging you to run. But in the end, the Oregon Supreme Court decided you were ineligible to run because you hadn't been a citizen here, a resident here, for 3 years prior to the election. How difficult was that decision for you to have to drop out of the race?
I mean, it was disappointing, but the upside of a career covering war and genocide is it completely gives you perspective on life's more petty disappointments, truly.
Well, let me read a quote from your book. You said, "It was the adventure of a lifetime. And while most of my professional adventures involved plane crashes or gunmen, this was less scary and no less thrilling. One of the things I've loved about journalism is the constant opportunity to learn new things and develop new muscles. And running for governor was the most invigorating of workouts, building sinews that I hadn't known existed." What were those sinews that you built, and what were some of the lessons that you learned?
You know, I think I started out thinking that politics is somewhat dysfunctional, and boy, it underscored that maybe it's even more dysfunctional than I thought. And, you know, the campaign finance issue, I think, was underscored to me that the median dollar in a primary campaign comes from somebody who's 67 years old. And in that situation, you don't have conversations with donors about high school graduation rates, about public school failings. You have conversations about things that are important to people in their 60s and 70s. And it's also, you know, I had always been, I've been paid to be provocative. I've been paid to tell people what I think, and sometimes to really annoy people. And all of a sudden, as a candidate, you know, I was sort of understandably had a team busy to try to rein me in when I was getting too provocative. But I remember meeting donors in Portland, and it's impossible to have a conversation, you know, without thinking about issues in Portland, partly because we were all worried our catalytic converters were being stolen, and there would be this pressure to, you know, to denounce Republicans as the problem. But I just kept thinking, look, fundamentally, you can't blame Republicans for the mess in Portland, because there really aren't any Republicans in Portland. This is our mess we created. That's a hard thing to say when you're a Democratic candidate for governor. And
you talk about that in your book, about how you felt like Portland saw progressivism going too far. How do you think Portland is doing now when you look at what's going on here now?
So I think there's been clear improvement in homelessness. Just visually, it seems to me there's an improvement there. Homicide rate has clearly come down. On the other hand, the homicide rate last year in Portland was 3 times that of New York City. I mean, that is inexcusable. I don't think we've solved the education problem. We have, I think, 38% chronic absenteeism. And I also worry about a cycle in which companies leave downtown Portland, move to Beaverton or Hillsborough or Lake Oswego, and that erodes the tax base in Portland. And I don't think so I don't know whether Portland has hit bottom in that sense in terms of this longer economic crisis.
Do you think you'll ever run for office again?
I think my wife might kill me if I did. So I think
is that a big no?
I think I'm one and done.
But you do have something going on at your family farm that's really exciting. It's Kristof Farms, and you're producing wine and cider. Tell us about that. Yeah.
So as long as my kids aren't watching, I can confess that this is partly an effort to rope our kids into, this project that we care a lot about. But it was also, we saw so much suffering and struggle in rural Oregon. We wanted to do something at our little micro level that might help create some jobs, create some branding for the community. And so we started the wine and cider business, and we sell it on our website and in some other places. And both the wine and cider have done really well. The cider just won an international award. And it's useful to me because, my day job, I shout at the world and tell it what to do, and it pays no attention. The wine and cider listen to me. They listen to me. And I guess also as a liberal columnist, I rarely meet a regulation I don't like. And all of a sudden, as a small business owner, I'm outraged at that effort to regulate me. And it's just good to see the world through a different prism now and then.
And quickly, what are you doing next? Are you going on a big story? What should we be watching for?
So as soon as I finish my book tour for Chasing Hope, I'll be headed off to the Middle East. That's been one of my preoccupations. We've got to do better there.
Well, I want to give you about 30 seconds for a final thought for our viewers and your readers.
So I guess I'd say that I think there's a lot of despair out there, especially among young people, about wars abroad, about climate change, about the domestic problems we face. And those challenges are very real. But what I have learned from covering all these crises is that we can work together to chip away at them, to make progress, and we need to do that.
Well, Nick Kristof, thank you for joining us here on Straight Talk.
Great to be with you,
It's been a pleasure. Make sure that you check out Nick's book, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. You can see it there. Get it at your bookstore, on Amazon, wherever you get your books. And I do want to let you know that I have so many more questions that I want to ask Nick that he's agreed to stay for a bonus episode of Straight Talk. We'll talk about some of his columns. We'll talk about the war in Gaza, about the election. You can find that on kgw.com and also on KGW's YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to our podcast, and we'll see you next week for Straight Talk. Have a great week.